Robert S. Johnson came home from a mission over France with 21 cannon rounds and more than 200 machine gun strikes punched into his P-47 Thunderbolt, and the engine still pulled him across the channel to a hard landing at RAF Manston in June 1943. A Focke-Wulf 190 pilot had emptied his guns into Johnson's fighter at close range, watched it refuse to fall, and then pulled alongside to look, before waving and peeling off, apparently out of ammunition. The German went home convinced he'd killed an American. Johnson taxied his wreck to a stop, climbed out, and counted the holes. The Pratt and Whitney R-2800 radial up front had eaten fire that would have drained the coolant and killed any liquid-cooled engine in seconds, and it kept turning. That radial was the whole argument. Where the Bf-109 and the Spitfire hung their slender inline engines behind a vulnerable glycol cooling system, Republic Aviation built the Thunderbolt around 18 air-cooled cylinders that didn't care about a punctured radiator because there was no radiator to puncture. The aircraft that resulted weighed close to 8 tons fully loaded, roughly double a Bf-109, and German pilots noticed. They called it the Jug, a name the Americans adopted with affection, and Luftwaffe airmen passed around the joke that you could dodge the P-47's fire by running for the cockpit and hiding behind your armor plate, because surely something that fat couldn't turn or climb. The men flying it heard the jokes secondhand and didn't entirely disagree at first. Early P-47C and P-47D models arriving with the 56th Fighter Group and the 4th Fighter Group in England through 1943 climbed sluggishly and ran short on range, which kept them tethered to bomber formations they couldn't escort deep into Germany. Hubert Zemke, who took command of the 56th, spent the spring of 1943 wrestling with an airplane that handled like a freight truck below 20,000 feet. The group's pilots were transitioning off the Spitfire, and the contrast was brutal on the controls. What the Jug did at altitude was a different story. The turbo supercharger buried in the rear fuselage, fed by ducting that ran the length of the airframe, let the R-2800 breathe above 30,000 feet, where the thin air strangled other fighters. Up there, the Thunderbolt was fast, and in a dive it was untouchable. The sheer mass that made it clumsy in a climb turned it into a falling anvil that no German fighter could follow without shedding its wings. Zemke built tactics around exactly that. Hold the high perch, dive through the enemy, zoom back up, never try to turn fight a 109. By the end of 1943, the 56th was the highest-scoring fighter group in the 8th Air Force, and the men who'd been handed a truck had learned to fly it like a guillotine. The numbers behind the airplane were enormous. Republic's plant at Farmingdale on Long Island, joined by a second line at Evansville, Indiana, would build 15,683 Thunderbolts before the war ended, more than any other American fighter. Each one carried 8.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, 4 in each wing, throwing a wall of fire that a contemporary pilot could feel in his teeth. The factory that produced them ran on the labor of a workforce that had built racing aircraft and amphibians a few years earlier, retooled under government contract into one of the densest concentrations of fighter production on Earth. The escort mission justified the program. But by 1944, a question was forming in the minds of men like Pete Quesada, watching the Jug come back from high-altitude fights with ammunition to spare and an airframe that simply would not break, and wondering what 8 tons of armored airplane could do if you pointed it at the ground. Elwood, Pete Quesada, was 40 years old in 1944 and had spent the pre-war decade as an aide to senior officers, flying VIPs and absorbing the politics of an air corps that worshipped the strategic bomber. He believed in something the bomber generals dismissed, that airpower's decisive contribution might come not over Berlin, but a few thousand feet above a tank column, working in real time with the ground troops. When the 9th Tactical Air Command stood up to support the First Army's invasion of France, Quesada got it, and he brought to the job an obsession with the connection between the cockpit and the foxhole. The aircraft he had to work with was changing underneath him. The bubble canopy P-47D, introduced in 1944, gave pilots the rearward visibility the Razorback models had lacked, and the airframe could haul a startling external load, up to 2,500 pounds of bombs and rockets, more than some early war medium bombers carried internally. The 8.50 calibers that had been built to shred fighters at altitude turned out to be devastating against soft and lightly armored targets on the ground. Trucks, half-tracks, locomotives, fuel bowsers, the supply tail that kept the German army moving. A Thunderbolt diving on a road column delivered a concentration of fire that left vehicles burning in rows. Quesada's real innovation wasn't the airplane, it was the radio. He pushed to put VHF sets from fighter aircraft into Sherman tanks rolling with the lead armored columns, so that a tank commander pinned by a German strongpoint could talk directly to the P-47 pilots orbiting overhead. The system that emerged after the Normandy breakout, refined through the summer of 1944, was called Armored Column Cover. Flights of Thunderbolts assigned to specific advancing columns, loitering above them, called down onto targets by forward air controllers, riding in the tanks themselves. It collapsed the time between a soldier seeing a threat and a fighter bomber destroying it from hours to minutes. The breakout that tested it was Operation Cobra, launched west of St. Lo on July 25, 1944. Quesada's fighter bombers flew ahead of the 7th Corps armor as it punched through the German line, and the columns of the 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions raced south with Thunderbolts welded to their advance. German movement by daylight became a death sentence. Vehicles caught on open roads were strafed and rocketed before they could reach cover, and the Wehrmacht learned to move at night and hide under trees in the day, surrendering the initiative that mobile warfare demanded. The pilots flying these missions came home filthy. Low-level work meant flak. The German 20mm and 37mm light anti-aircraft guns that hosed the sky over any target worth attacking, and the casualty rate for fighter bomber pilots ran higher than for the high-altitude escort squadrons. A P-47 could absorb punishment that would have downed a P-51 Mustang, whose belly radiator made it fatally vulnerable to a single rifle-caliber hit on a ground pass. Quesada's men understood the trade-off. The Jug's weight and its air-cooled engine, the very things the German pilots had mocked, made it the aircraft you wanted when the mission was to fly low and slow over an enemy who was shooting straight up at you. By August, the German army in Normandy was breaking, and the pursuit toward the Seine turned the roads into a shooting gallery. The targets that began appearing under the Thunderbolt's guns were no longer just trucks and trains. They were tanks, Panthers and Mark IVs, pulling back along clogged roads with nowhere to hide. And the question of whether a fighter bomber could actually kill a tank, debated endlessly in the abstract, was about to be answered in the open country south of Falaise. The killing ground was a pocket. By the 3rd week of August 1944, the German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army were trapped in a closing bag between Falaise and Ardennes, with American forces under Patton driving up from the south and Anglo-Canadian forces pressing down from the north. The only way out ran east through a narrowing gap, and the roads through that gap filled with the entire mechanized strength of 2 German armies trying to escape at once. For the fighter bombers orbiting above, it was the target every pilot had imagined, and almost none had ever seen. The 9th and 19th Tactical Air Commands flew against the pocket in relays. Thunderbolts and Typhoons, the British equivalent in the ground attack role, worked the roads from dawn to dusk, and the destruction they inflicted became one of the most argued over questions of the campaign. The visual evidence was overwhelming. Post-war survey teams walking the gap counted thousands of destroyed and abandoned vehicles, and the photographs of the Chambois-Troun road show wreckage packed bumper to bumper for miles. Horses and men and machines fused into a single mass of destruction that nauseated the soldiers who had to clear it. Eisenhower walked the ground days later and wrote that it could only be described by Dante, that one could walk for hundreds of yards, stepping on nothing but dead and decaying flesh. The accounting is where historians grow careful. When operational research teams examined the wreckage, they found that the great majority of destroyed armored vehicles had been abandoned, blown up by their own crews, or knocked out by ground fire, not by air attack. The rockets the Thunderbolts and Typhoons fired, the 4.5-inch and 5-inch projectiles meant to punch through armor, turned out to be wildly inaccurate. Hit probability against a tank-sized target was low, and a near miss did little. The claim that fighter bombers were tank busters in the literal sense, that they destroyed tanks in large numbers with direct hits, does not survive contact with the survey data. What the air attack actually did was more important and harder to photograph. It destroyed the soft vehicles, the trucks and fuel carriers and ammunition haulers that kept the tanks fed and moving. A panther with no fuel and no path forward through a road blocked by burning wrecks is a dead panther whether a rocket finds it or not, and the crew that abandons it and walks away is a crew removed from the war. The Thunderbolts created the conditions for the rout. They turned every daylight road into a trap, froze German movement, and broke the cohesion of an army trying to retreat under fire. The tanks counted as abandoned in the survey were often abandoned because air attack had made movement impossible. The psychological effect on German crews was real and documented in their own words. Prisoners taken at Falaise described the Jabos, their term for the fighter bombers, short for Jagdbomber, as a constant, inescapable presence, and tank crews testified that they feared the aircraft circling overhead more than they feared the artillery. The joke about the fat American fighter had curdled. A weapon that German pilots had mocked for being too heavy to dogfight was now the thing their armored crews scanned the sky for. The sound that sent them diving out of vehicles and into the ditches along the road. Somewhere between 50 and 100,000 German troops escaped the pocket before it closed on August 21st, but they came out without most of their equipment, on foot, having left the mechanized heart of two armies burning in the Norman countryside, and the men who'd flown above it were already learning that the next test would be harder. The 5-inch rocket was the problem, and the men flying with it knew it before the operational researchers proved it. The high-velocity aircraft rocket, the HVAR, nicknamed Holy Moses, entered service in mid-1944 as a substantial improvement over the earlier tube-launched designs. A 5-inch projectile carried on rails under the wings, fired in salvos at ground targets. Against trains, trucks, buildings, and gun positions, it was effective. Against a moving tank, it was a prayer. The rocket had no guidance, a flat enough trajectory that it dropped noticeably over the few hundred yards of a firing pass, and a dispersion pattern that meant a pilot aiming at a single vehicle was really aiming at the patch of ground around it. Pilots compensated with the thing the Thunderbolt did best, which was carry guns. The 8.50 caliber Brownings, firing armor-piercing incendiary rounds, couldn't penetrate the frontal armor of a Panther or a Tiger, but the top and rear decks of every German tank were thin, and a Thunderbolt diving steeply could rake the engine deck where the armor measured well under an inch. A burst into the rear of a tank could start an engine fire, rupture fuel lines, or cook off ammunition through the thinner plate, and the volume of fire the 8 guns delivered in a single pass gave the pilot a real chance of putting rounds where they mattered. It was not the clean tank killing of legend. It was a steep dive, a half-second of fire, and a pull-out low enough to draw every flak gun in the area. The bombs did the rest. A P-47 carrying 2 500-pound bombs, or a pair of 1,000-pounders, could crater a road, drop a bridge, or, with a direct hit or a very close near miss, flip or disable a tank through blast and shock even without penetration. The fragmentation bomb and, later in the war, napalm canisters added to the arsenal. Napalm, the jellied gasoline incendiary that the Americans began using in quantity in 1944, was particularly feared. A tank caught in a napalm splash could have its crew burned out, or its rubber and fuel ignited, and the weapon's wide footprint forgave the aiming errors that doomed the rockets. The fighter-bomber pilots developed their craft under fire through the late summer and fall of 1944. The 405th and 406th Fighter Groups, flying Thunderbolts for the 9th Air Force, became specialists in the ground attack role, and their pilots logged the kind of low-level work that wore men down fast. Quesada and his counterpart commanding the 19th TAC, Otto P. Wayland, Patton's air partner through the breakneck advance across France, pushed the tactics forward continuously, refining the dive angles, the run-in procedures, the coordination with the artillery that suppressed flak while the fighters worked. Wayland's partnership with Patton became the model for the whole theory of tactical air. As Third Army raced east in August, Wayland's Thunderbolts guarded its exposed southern flank along the Loire, flying reconnaissance and strike missions that let Patton ignore a flank he had no troops to cover. The air cover was so effective that the German garrison at the city of Beaugency, some 20,000 men under General Botho Elster, surrendered in September not to ground troops, but after being harried by Wayland's aircraft, negotiating their capitulation with the threat of continued air attack hanging over them. The system worked because the Americans had something the Germans by late 1944 had lost: command of the air. The Luftwaffe that might have contested the fighter bombers was being ground down over Germany by the escort fighters, the same P-47's and P-51's that had spent the spring clearing the sky. A Thunderbolt pilot working a road in France could concentrate on the ground because almost nothing was coming down at him from above, and that fact, more than any rocket, was what turned the jug into the German tanker's nightmare. The air the Thunderbolts owned over France had been won over Germany, in a campaign of attrition that the bomber crews paid for in blood through the brutal winter and spring of 1943 to 44. The P-47, for all its later fame as a ground attack aircraft, began the European war as an escort fighter, and its central limitation in that role was range. Even with belly tanks, the early Jugs couldn't follow the B-17's and B-24's all the way to targets like Schweinfurt and Regensburg, and the second Schweinfurt raid in October 1943, 60 bombers lost out of 291 dispatched, proved what happened to unescorted formations over the Reich. The fix was incremental and unglamorous: bigger drop tanks, more of them, and a doctrine shift that let the escorts go hunting. By early 1944, P-47's carrying paper composite and metal drop tanks could reach deep into Germany, and when General Jimmy Doolittle took over the 8th Air Force in January 1944, he changed the rules. The fighters had been chained to the bombers, forbidden to leave the formation. Doolittle cut them loose, telling them to seek out and destroy the Luftwaffe wherever they could find it, in the air and on the ground. The order, by one account, was to pursue the enemy fighters and shoot them up at their bases. The Thunderbolt, with its 8 guns and its ability to absorb ground fire, was ideally suited to the strafing campaign against German airfields that followed. The 56th Fighter Group under Zemke remained the Jug's standard bearer in the air-to-air fight. Its pilots, Johnson, Gabreski, Schilling, ran up scores that made them household names in the aviation press. Francis Gabby Gabreski became the top American ace in Europe with 28 aerial victories before he clipped a propeller on a strafing run in July 1944 and spent the rest of the war as a prisoner. Robert Johnson finished with 27. These men flew the same basic airframe that other pilots were using to burn German supply columns, and their success in the air directly enabled the ground attack mission by destroying the Luftwaffe that might have stopped it. The arithmetic of attrition favored the Americans because American industry could replace losses the Germans could not. Republic's 2 plants kept the pipeline full, and the training command kept producing pilots, while the Luftwaffe by 1944 was losing experienced airmen faster than it could train replacements. Big Week in February 1944, a concentrated series of raids on the German aircraft industry, escorted by the now long-legged American fighters, cost the Luftwaffe pilots it could never recover, and the loss rate among German fighter units climbed through the spring as the escorts hunted them down. The Thunderbolt was a major contributor to that bleeding. By the time of the Normandy invasion in June 1944, the Allied air forces had achieved something close to total air supremacy over the invasion area. On D-Day, the Luftwaffe managed only a handful of sorties over the beaches. The famous instruction attributed to Eisenhower captured the result. He told the troops that if they saw fighters overhead, the planes would be Allied. That supremacy was the precondition for everything the fighter-bombers would do in the weeks that followed, and the men who'd won it by escorting bombers to Berlin had handed the ground attack pilots a free hand. The transition wasn't clean. Many 8th Air Force P-47 groups converted to the longer-ranged P-51 Mustang through 1944, leaving the Thunderbolt increasingly to the 9th Air Force and the tactical role. The Jug found its truest calling not at 30,000 feet, but at 500, and the campaign that defined it was about to move from the hedgerows of Normandy into the open, frozen ground of the Ardennes. The weather grounded them when they were needed most. When the German offensive erupted out of the Ardennes forest, on December 16, 1944, low cloud and fog blanketed the front, and the fighter bombers that had become the German army's tormentor were blind. Field Marshal von Rundstedt had chosen the timing precisely because the forecast promised days of weather that would keep Allied aircraft on the ground, and for the first week of the Battle of the Bulge, the German columns moved within freedom they hadn't known since before Normandy. The skies over the Ardennes stayed shut. The clearing came on December 23rd. High pressure moved in, the ceiling lifted, and the 9 and 29 tactical air commands threw everything they had into the air. The change was immediate and decisive. German columns that had advanced under cover of cloud were suddenly exposed on the roads of the Ardennes, and the Thunderbolts and Mustangs fell on them with a week's accumulated fury. The relief of Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne had held the crossroads town through the siege, came as the weather broke, Patton's Third Army driving up from the south while the fighter bombers hammered the German forces ringing the town. The Bastogne airdrops told their own story of the air arms range. On December 23rd, C-47 transports flew low over the encircled town and dropped supplies to McAuliffe's surrounded paratroopers, and the next days saw gliders bring in ammunition and a surgical team. The fighter bombers escorted the transports and worked the German positions around the perimeter. McAuliffe's reply to the German surrender demand, the single word nuts, has become the defining American line of the battle. But the substance behind the defiance was the certainty that the weather would clear and the air would come. When it did, the Thunderbolts went back to the work they'd perfected in Normandy. German armor caught on the narrow Ardennes roads, hemmed in by forest and snow, made even better targets than the columns at Falaise. The 1st SS Panzer Division, Kampfgruppe Piper, the spearhead that had murdered American prisoners at Malmedy on December 17th, found its advance strangled partly by the air attack that fell on its fuel and supply lines once the skies opened. Piper's tanks, perpetually short of the gasoline the offensive depended on, were abandoned by the dozen as his battle group disintegrated, many of them simply out of fuel, the same dynamic that had killed the German army at Falaise, replayed in the snow. The fuel shortage was the German offensive's fatal flaw, and the air attack made it worse. The whole operation had been gambled on capturing American fuel dumps because German production couldn't sustain the drive to the Meuse, and when the seizures failed and the air attack closed the roads to resupply, the spearheads ran dry. Thunderbolts strafing fuel convoys and bombing the choke points turned a logistics problem into a catastrophe. The German armored vehicles that survey teams would later count as abandoned in the Ardennes told the Falaise story again. Tanks undamaged by enemy fire, left by crews who had no fuel and no road forward. The cost to the pilots stayed high. Flak over the Ardennes was thick, and the low-level work in marginal winter weather killed men through accident as much as enemy fire. But by the end of January 1945, the bulge had been erased. The Germans pushed back to their start lines, having spent the last mobile reserve they would ever assemble in the West. The fighter bombers had not won the battle alone. The infantry in the snow had done that, but they had broken the back of the German movement once the weather let them fly, and the road into Germany itself now lay open. The Thunderbolts' war wasn't only in Europe. In the China-Burma-India theater and the Pacific, the same airframe flew a different war, and the long-range version built specifically for the Pacific's vast distances, the P-47N, with a redesigned wing carrying internal fuel and an even larger drop tank capacity, entered service in 1945 to escort B-29s over Japan from bases in the Marianas and on Ieshima. The N model could fly missions of over 2,000 miles, a staggering reach for a single-engine fighter, and it brought the Jug's ruggedness to a theater where an engine hit over open ocean meant a long swim or none at all. In Burma, RAF and American Thunderbolts flew ground attack against Japanese forces in terrain that punished aircraft and crews alike, and the type's ability to absorb damage proved as valuable over jungle as it had over France. The 10th Air Force used Thunderbolts in the close support role supporting the ground campaign to reopen the land route to China, and the aircraft's bomb and rocket load made it effective against the bunkers and entrenchments the Japanese favored. The work was less famous than the European campaign, but drew on the same hard-won tactical lessons. Back in Europe, the war was ending, and the fighter bombers spent the spring of 1945 ranging across a collapsing Germany. The targets thinned as the Wehrmacht disintegrated, and the missions shifted toward the last pockets of resistance, the jet airfields where the Me-262 had appeared, and the endless columns of a German army in retreat and surrender. The Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, faster than anything the Allies flew, was a genuine threat in the air, but the Americans answered it the way Doolittle had taught them to answer the Luftwaffe, by hitting it on the ground, strafing the airfields, and catching the jets in their vulnerable takeoff and landing patterns when their speed advantage meant nothing. The man who'd built American tactical air power into a war-winning instrument, Pete Quesada, ended the war a major general at 38, having proved a doctrine the pre-war Air Corps had barely tolerated. His insistence on the radio link between tank and aircraft, on treating the fighter-bomber as an extension of the ground commander's reach, became the foundation of close air support for the next half-century. The Thunderbolt was the instrument that proved the concept, not because it was the most elegant fighter of the war, but because it was the one that could fly low into a wall of flak and come home. The numbers at the end were staggering. P-47's flew more than 546,000 combat sorties in the war, dropped more than 130,000 tons of bombs, fired 60,000 rockets, and 135 million rounds of .50 caliber ammunition. They claimed the destruction of thousands of enemy aircraft, tens of thousands of vehicles, thousands of locomotives and rail cars. The loss rate, for an aircraft that spent so much of its career in the deadliest flight regime of the war, was remarkably low, a tribute to the air-cooled engine and the heavy structure that German pilots had laughed at in 1943. The joke had run its full course. A fighter mocked for being too fat to dogfight had become the aircraft a German tank crew feared above all others, the sound that sent them out of their vehicles and into the ditches, the weapon that made daylight movement a sentence of death. The men who flew it, Johnson, Gabreski, Zemke, and the thousands of anonymous fighter-bomber pilots who worked the roads at 500 feet, had taken a flawed escort fighter and discovered what it was actually for, and the institution they helped build would outlast the airplane itself. The doctrine survived the aircraft that proved it. When the Air Force became a separate service in 1947, the close air support mission that Quesada and Wayland had pioneered with the Thunderbolt became a permanent and contested part of American military thinking. Contested because the bomber generals who dominated the pre-war Air Corps still believed the decisive use of air power lay in strategic bombing, not in supporting troops on the ground. The argument over who should own close air support and how much it should matter would run through Korea and Vietnam and beyond, and it traced directly back to the radios Quesada had jammed into Sherman tanks in the summer of 1944. The Thunderbolt itself faded fast. Jets made the piston fighter obsolete within a few years, and the P-47 was retired from frontline U.S. service by the early 1950s, soldiering on in the air forces of other nations into the following decade. Republic Aviation, the company that had built nearly 16,000 of them, moved on to the jet age with the F-84 and later the F-105 Thunderchief, a name deliberately chosen to echo the wartime jug, and an aircraft that would carry the ground attack tradition into the skies over Vietnam. The most direct descendant came decades later, when the Air Force in the 1970s finally built a dedicated close air support aircraft, one designed from scratch around the mission rather than adapted to it. It named the result the A-10 Thunderbolt II, an explicit tribute to the wartime P-47. The A-10 was everything the doctrine had learned: heavily armored, able to absorb battle damage and fly home, built around a massive gun, designed to fly low and slow over a battlefield bristling with anti-aircraft fire and kill the enemy's armor. The titanium bathtub protecting the A-10's pilot was the conceptual heir of the R-2800. That had carried Robert Johnson home full of holes in 1943. The men who'd flown the original lived long enough to see it. Gabreski returned to combat in Korea, became a jet ace in the F-86 Sabre, and retired a colonel with one of the highest combined war victory totals in American history. Robert Johnson left the service after the war and worked in the aviation industry, telling and retelling the story of the day a German pilot emptied his guns into his Thunderbolt and flew away certain he'd made a kill. Hubert Zemke, shot down and captured late in the war, served as the senior Allied officer in a German prison camp and brought his men through to liberation. These were not abstractions. They were the pilots who'd learned what the jug could do. The German pilots who'd made the jokes had their own reckoning to record. In their post-war interviews and memoirs, Luftwaffe veterans spoke with respect of the aircraft they'd underestimated, the toughness that let it come home from damage that would have killed their own fighters, the sheer volume of fire from its 8 guns, the way it could dive faster than anything they flew. The contempt of 1943 had been a misjudgment born of looking at the wrong numbers. They'd measured the Thunderbolt by its weight and its turning circle and concluded it was a poor fighter. They'd missed what that weight bought: an engine that didn't die when it was hit, a structure that didn't fail when it was shot, and a load-carrying capacity that turned a fighter into the most effective ground attack aircraft the U.S. Army Air Forces put into the European War. The tanks burning along the roads from Falaise to the Ardennes had settled the argument the jokes started. A fighter too fat to dogfight had found a better war to fight, and the German crews who scanned the sky for the Jabos understood by the end exactly what the bulk they'd laughed at was for.